Some stories don't start in boardrooms or courtrooms. They start in dirt, in the kind of red Georgia clay that gets under your fingernails and never fully washes out. The kind of land that doesn't care what your bank account looks like or what anybody in town thinks about you. The land just sits there patient, quiet, and waiting to see what you're made of. This is the story of Elijah Carter, and if you've never heard his name before, that's okay, because for most of his life, neither had anybody else. Elijah Carter was 53 years old, and on most mornings he woke up before the sun did. Not because he had to, not because anyone was watching, but because the farm demanded it, and Elijah had never been the kind of man who let something he loved go unattended. He lived on 40 acres of land in rural Georgia, land that had been in his family since his grandfather, James Carter, had scratched and scraped and sacrificed to buy it back in 1949. That was a time in the South when a black man owning land wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. James Carter had known that. He had carried that weight every day of his life. And he had passed the land and the weight on to his son, who passed it on to Elijah. 40 acres sounds like a lot until you actually stand on it and see what time and drought and debt can do to a piece of ground. The soil on Elijah's farm was dry. It had been dry for 3 summers in a row. His irrigation system was held together with duct tape and prayer. His one tractor, a green John Deere that had seen better days sometime around 2003, broke down at least twice a season, and Elijah had become something of an expert at diagnosing engine problems with nothing but a flashlight and a YouTube tutorial. He had debts, real debts. The kind that come with interest rates that don't care about your feelings. His mother, Ruth, was 78 years old and needed medication for her heart that cost more than most people's car payments. The roof on the farmhouse had a slow leak that became a fast leak every time it rained, which in Georgia is often. Most people in Clover County, Georgia would have looked at Elijah's situation and called it hopeless. Most people did. But 3 years before this story really begins, Elijah had done something that made the whole town talk. He applied for one of Georgia's new legal cannabis cultivation licenses. Now, legal cannabis farming in Georgia was still a new thing. The state had opened up limited medical cannabis licenses, and the application process was brutal. Paperwork, fees, inspections, background checks, more paperwork, more fees. Most of the people who got licenses were backed by investors or corporations with lawyers on retainer. Elijah had none of that. What he had was time, stubbornness, and a library card. He spent 18 months researching everything he could about cannabis cultivation, Georgia agricultural law, and small farm licensing. He made friends with a retired agricultural extension agent named Harold Bishop, who helped him understand the soil requirements. He drove 4 hours round trip 4 separate times to meet with a legal aid clinic in Atlanta that helped small farmers navigate the licensing process. He was rejected the first time, he reapplied. He was rejected the second time, he reapplied again. On the third attempt, 3 years after he started, Elijah Carter received his legal cannabis cultivation license in the mail. He stood in the kitchen with the letter in his hands, and for just a moment, one quiet, private moment, he closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath that nobody else heard. When he walked outside, he got back to work. The people in town heard about it, of course. In a small county, news travels faster than weather. Cannabis, said old Dale Hutchins down at the feed store. Man can't afford fertilizer and he's going to grow cannabis, that's rich. Some people laughed, some people shook their heads. A few offered a tight, polite smile that said everything without saying anything at all. Elijah heard it all. He just kept walking through his field every morning before sunrise, checking each plant the way you check on someone you love, carefully, hopefully, always looking for signs of life. To him, this wasn't just a crop. It was his last real chance to save the thing his grandfather had built, to honor a man who had sacrificed more than Elijah would ever fully understand, to prove that this family, this land, this name, Carter, still meant something. He wasn't growing cannabis, he was growing a legacy. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when the black SUV appeared at the end of Elijah's dirt road, not one SUV, 3. They moved slowly, deliberately, kicking up a cloud of red dust that hung in the autumn air like smoke from a signal fire. Elijah was in the field when he heard them. He straightened up and shielded his eyes from the morning sun and watched them come. He had never seen cars like that on his road before. They parked in a neat line just outside the farmhouse, and the men who stepped out didn't look like county inspectors or bank representatives. They were large, quiet, and their eyes moved the way the eyes of men move when they have been trained to notice everything and show nothing. Then the last door opened. Rafael Cruz stepped out into the Georgia morning like he owned it already. He was a tall man, perhaps 50 years old. with silver hair combed back from a sharp face and eyes the color of shallow water, light enough to see through, but cold enough to make you not want to look too long. He wore a white linen suit that had no business being that clean on a dirt farm road. A gold watch caught the sunlight on his wrist. Elijah had never seen Rafael Cruz before, but he knew the type. You don't grow up black in rural Georgia without learning how to read power when it walks toward you. He set down his tools and walked to meet the man. Mr. Carter, Rafael said, and his voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who has never once worried about being late to anything because everything always waits for him. Beautiful morning. It was, Elijah said. Rafael smiled at that, a thin, practiced smile that didn't involve his eyes. One of his men carried a briefcase. Rafael took it, set it on the hood of the first SUV, and clicked it open with the ceremony of a man who knows he is about to make an impression. Inside was money, more money than Elijah had ever seen in one place in his life. Stacked bills bound in rubber bands filling every inch of that briefcase like a wall built out of green paper. $2 million, Rafael said, folding his hands in front of him. Cash today for the farm. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Elijah looked at the briefcase. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But somewhere inside him something shifted, because $2 million is not an abstract number when you are behind on your mortgage, when your mother's prescriptions cost more than you earn in a month. When you lie awake some nights wondering if this is going to be the season the whole thing finally falls apart. His hands, those hands that had dug in this dirt since he was 7 years old, his hands trembled. Just for a second, just enough. 2 million, Elijah said slowly, as if he was testing the sound of it. 2 million, Rafael confirmed. And we can have the paperwork done by Thursday. You walk away with cash in hand, debts cleared, and you never have to worry about any of this again. Elijah stared at the money. He thought about his mother. He thought about the roof. He thought about the broken tractor and the dry soil and the 3 rejections before the license finally came through. He thought about what it would feel like to not wake up before the sun, not because he loved the farm, but because the farm was gone. He thought about all of that. And then Rafael Cruz smiled, and it was a different smile this time. It was the smile of a man who has already decided how this ends. After today, Rafael said quietly, this land belongs to me, legal papers or not. Something in Elijah went very still. He looked at the briefcase again. He looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at a door you know you shouldn't open, and then he reached out and he closed it. The snap of the latches was the loudest sound on that farm. My grandfather didn't survive the South, Elijah said, just so I could sell his land to a criminal. Rafael's smile disappeared, not dramatically, not with anger, it just vanished, and what was left beneath it was something colder and more honest. You're making a dangerous choice, old man. Elijah met his gaze. He didn't look away, he didn't blink. No, he said, I'm making the right one. There was a long pause. Rafael studied Elijah the way a man studies a problem he hasn't encountered before, not with respect exactly, but with a recalibration. Then he straightened his jacket, nodded once, and walked back to his SUV. The 3 black vehicles pulled back down the dirt road and disappeared into the morning. Elijah stood there for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. That night, Elijah's barn burned. He woke up to the orange light bleeding through his bedroom curtains, and the smell of smoke so thick he could taste it before he was fully awake. By the time he got outside, the barn was already gone, not burning, but gone. Transformed into a roaring column of fire that lit up the Georgia night sky and sent sparks drifting out over the dark field like evil stars. He stood there in his work boots and his undershirt and he watched it burn. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just watched, the way you watch something you've already grieved, not because it doesn't hurt, but because the hurting is happening somewhere deeper than tears can reach. The volunteer fire department arrived 20 minutes later and did what they could. A state police cruiser pulled up around 2 a.m. An officer asked him a few questions, wrote some things down, and told Elijah they'd look into it. The officer's voice had the particular flatness of a man who doesn't expect to find much. By morning, the whole county knew. They came out to see it, neighbors, people from town, people Elijah barely recognized, standing at the edge of his property and looking at the smoking ruins of the barn. Some of them had the decency to look sorry. Others whispered to each other in low voices, and Elijah could feel the shape of what they were saying even if he couldn't hear the words. He should have taken the money. He should have known better. What did he expect? Elijah walked past all of them. He walked straight into the still warm ashes, careful where he stepped, reading the ground the way he read his field, with patience and attention and a willingness to find something where others saw nothing. His grandfather's voice came to him then. An old memory, James Carter, leaning on a fence post when Elijah was maybe 10 years old, pointing at the ground beneath their feet. This land holds everything, Eli. You put something in it, it keeps it. Even when everything else burns down, the ground remembers. Elijah stopped walking. He looked down at the floor of the barn, or what had been the floor. The wood was blackened and in places burned through entirely, but there in one corner, protected by a fallen section of iron roofing, the original floorboards were still intact. He knelt down, he pulled away the debris with his bare hands. And there, just where his grandfather had always said there was a good safe place on this farm, was a small metal box, scorched on the outside, sealed with a simple latch and absolutely untouched by the fire. His grandfather's box. Elijah had known about it for years, in the vague way you know about family heirlooms, aware of their existence but not their contents. James Carter had told his son there were important papers in there. His son had told Elijah the same thing, he'd never opened it. Now, sitting in the ash and smoke of what used to be his barn, he opened it. Inside were papers. Old ones, the kind that crinkle when you handle them and smell like a different era. There were land records. Tax receipts going back to 1949 that documented every payment his grandfather had made every year unbroken. There was a hand-drawn map of the property lines, more accurate and more detailed than anything the county office had on file. And at the bottom there were two documents that Elijah didn't immediately understand. They were engineering surveys, federal ones dated 1967. And what they showed, in the precise, unhurried language of government infrastructure, was that a major water supply pipeline ran directly beneath the northeast corner of Elijah's farm. A pipeline that fed water to a significant portion of the surrounding county. A pipeline that, according to those papers, carried with it a federal easement, meaning the land above it was subject to federal jurisdiction, not just county authority, and any construction development or illegal operation on the surrounding properties would be subject to federal review if it interfered with that pipeline. Elijah sat in the ashes for a very long time. He read those papers 3 times. He didn't fully understand everything they said, but he understood enough. Elijah had met Special Agent Darnell Washington exactly once before, 2 years ago at a community meeting about rural crime in Clover County. Washington was a quiet man with careful eyes and a business card that said FBI Field Office, Atlanta. He had given that card to Elijah after the meeting and said, "If you ever see something that doesn't sit right, Mr. Carter, I want to know about it." Elijah had kept the card. He didn't call from the farmhouse. He drove 40 minutes to a pay phone at a gas station outside of town, one of the last functioning pay phones in the county, kept alive by a gas station owner who said he didn't trust cell phones, and he called the number on the card. Washington answered on the second ring. Elijah talked. Washington listened. There was a long silence when Elijah finished. "Don't tell anyone else what you found," Washington said. "Don't move those papers. I'll be there tomorrow morning." Washington arrived the next morning with 2 other agents. And when he saw the documents Elijah laid out on the kitchen table, the pipeline surveys, the federal easement paperwork, the land records, he went very quiet in the way that people go quiet when they realize something important has just shifted. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we have been building a case against Rafael Cruz for 4 years. We knew about his operations in this county. What we didn't have, what we couldn't establish, was a federal nexus. A reason to bring the full weight of federal law enforcement to bear." He tapped the pipeline survey. This is the reason. What Elijah didn't know, what very few people in Clover County knew, was the full scale of what Rafael Cruz had been building in the surrounding land. Under the cover of several seemingly legitimate agricultural businesses, Cruz had been using the rural properties around Elijah's farm as processing and distribution points for a drug operation that stretched across 3 states. He had quietly bought or pressured nearly every landowner within a 5-mile radius, all except one. Rafael Cruz had wanted Elijah's farm not just because of its location, but because the federal pipeline easement beneath it, which Cruz's own lawyers had apparently never discovered, meant that any serious federal investigation of the surrounding land would have to acknowledge Elijah's property as a protected corridor. As long as Elijah owned that land, Cruz could not completely insulate his operation from federal scrutiny. He had needed Elijah gone. When Elijah refused, he tried to burn him out. He didn't know about the box. 3 days passed. They were the quietest 3 days Elijah could remember on the farm. No tractor running, no barn to work in, just the field and the plants and the slow, patient work of a man who has decided to keep going even when he's not sure what going will lead to. On the 4th morning, the black SUVs came back. There were more of them this time, 5 vehicles, more men. Rafael Cruz stepped out again, and this time there was no briefcase, no pretense of transaction. He looked at the ruins of the barn without expression. He looked at Elijah on the porch. "Still standing?" he said. And there was something in his voice, not quite contempt, not quite disbelief. Something closer to the sound a man makes when a situation has become, to him, a matter of principle. Elijah stood up from his chair. He looked at Rafael Cruz in the early morning light. He thought about his grandfather standing in this same yard, in a Georgia that was meaner and harder and more openly hostile to a man like him, and still standing, still holding the deed. Barely, Elijah said, but standing. Then the sirens came. They came from three directions at once, from the main road, from the old county route to the east, and from the fire road on the north side of the property that Elijah hadn't even known was accessible to vehicles. Federal vehicles, blue and white and moving fast, converged on the farm with the coordinated precision of something that had been planned for days, because it had been. Rafael Cruz's men had weapons. Some of them reached for those weapons. Some of them thought about it. And then they looked at the number of federal agents surrounding the property and made the only sensible calculation available to them. They put their hands up. Rafael Cruz didn't run. Elijah would give him that. He stood in the dirt of Elijah's driveway and watched his operation collapse around him with the rigid stillness of a man who has always known, somewhere deep down, that this was how it ended. He just hadn't expected it to end here. He hadn't expected it to end because of this man. Elijah walked down from the porch. He crossed the yard and stopped 10 feet from Cruz. He held up the old papers, the surveys, the easement documents, the proof that this land was more important than anyone had realized. "You wanted my farm," Elijah said. Raphael stared at him. "But you forgot one thing." Elijah looked at the ground beneath their feet, the red Georgia clay, the dry, stubborn, patient soil that his grandfather had bought and paid for and loved for 50 years. "This land remembers who really owns it." Agent Washington put Rafael Cruz in handcuffs as the morning sun came fully over the tree line and lit the field gold. The arrest made national news by that evening. The headline, "Georgia Farmer's Discovery Helps FBI Bring Down Multi-State Drug Operation," ran on every major news network and spread across the internet within hours. By the next morning, Elijah Carter's name was known in places that had never heard of Clover County, Georgia. The story had everything that stories need: a small man against a powerful one, a family legacy, a metal box in the ashes, an act of refusal that turned out to be an act of courage. Reporters called the farmhouse. Television vans parked on the dirt road. People Elijah hadn't spoken to in years reached out to say they'd always believed in him, which he received with the quiet grace of a man who remembers exactly who believed in him and who didn't. But Elijah didn't become what people expected him to become. He didn't move to Atlanta. He didn't buy a new truck or a bigger house. He didn't go on speaking tour or take the book deal that a publisher in New York offered him through an agent he'd never heard of. He rebuilt his barn. He hired 3 men from the county, men who were out of work and needed it, to help him do the framing and the roofing. He paid them fairly, fed them lunch every day, and when the work was done, he kept 2 of them on as permanent farm workers. With the legal action resulting from Cruz's arrest, several of the surrounding properties, the ones Cruz had purchased under shell companies, were seized by the federal government. A portion of those assets, after the legal proceedings concluded, were directed through a rural development program back into the county. Elijah worked with Agent Washington and a local nonprofit to ensure that some of that money reached small farmers in the region who had been squeezed, pressured, or bought out by Cruz's operation over the years. Some of those farmers got their land back, not all of them. The law is what the law is, and justice is rarely complete, but some. Elijah expanded his cannabis operation, legally, carefully, with the same methodical attention he'd brought to everything since the beginning. He brought on a partner, a young black woman from Savannah named Kezia Monroe, who had an agriculture degree and ideas about soil remediation that Elijah found genuinely exciting. Together, they turned the dry, struggling acreage into something that actually produced. The first profitable season came 2 years after the fire. Elijah stood in the field on the morning the numbers came in and looked at his plants for a long time. Then he called his mother. "Mama," he said, "the farm's going to be okay." Ruth Carter cried on the phone, and Elijah let her and didn't say anything, because some things don't need words. Every year, beginning with that first profitable season, Elijah Carter set aside a portion of his farm's earnings for a fund he called the Carter Land Trust. The purpose was simple: to help young black farmers in Georgia and the surrounding states access the capital, the legal support, and the technical resources they needed to buy land, get licensed, and build something lasting. The barriers to land ownership for black farmers in America are not abstract. They are documented, historical, and ongoing, from the systematic discrimination in federal farm loan programs that cheated black farmers out of billions of dollars over decades. to the quiet social and economic pressures that make it harder to hold onto land in communities where that land has become valuable to others. Elijah had lived all of that. He hadn't read about it. He'd felt it in his hands and in his bank account and in the way certain people looked at him and his 40 acres. He wasn't going to fix it alone, but he was going to do something. By the fifth year, the Carter Land Trust had helped 11 young farmers, ranging in age from 22 to 47, secure either land purchases or long-term farm leases. 4 of them were growing legal crops, 2 were in the licensing process, and the rest were in earlier stages, learning and planning and working towards something. Elijah visited each of their farms at least once a year. He didn't go as a benefactor or a celebrity. He went as a farmer. He walked their fields with them. He asked about their soil and their water access and their equipment. He shared what had worked for him and what hadn't, and he listened to what they were learning, because he knew that every farmer knows something you don't. When a reporter from a major magazine came to do a profile on him, this was 3 years after the arrest. When the story had settled into the kind of American legend that people reference without always knowing the details, she asked him what he wanted people to take away from everything that had happened. Elijah thought about it. "I want young people to understand," he said, "that the most powerful thing you can own is land, not because of what it's worth on paper, but because of what it means, what it represents, what it holds." He paused. "My grandfather understood that. He bought this land when it was dangerous to buy it, in a state that didn't want him to have it, and he kept it. He kept it because he knew that the generation after him would need somewhere to stand." The reporter asked him about the night Rafael Cruz made his offer. She asked whether he had truly never been tempted. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "Of course I was tempted," he said. "That would have been a lot of money. It would have solved a lot of problems." He looked out at the field. "But some offers don't make you rich, they make you owned." That line traveled far. It was quoted in editorials and shared across social media and referenced in speeches. A high school principal in Mississippi put it on her school's wall. A documentary filmmaker put it at the end of a film about black land ownership in America. Elijah didn't think much about any of that. He was too busy farming. This is the part of the story where most tellings try to make everything neat, where the lesson wraps up like a bow on a gift and you're sent away feeling certain about something. But Elijah Carter's story doesn't end neatly because it hasn't ended. He's still out there on his 40 acres. The soil is still dry some years and wet others. The work is still hard. The industry is still complicated. The history of this land, of all the land in this country, is still complicated. What changed is not that everything became easy. What changed is that one man, a poor black farmer from rural Georgia with a broken tractor and a legal cannabis license and more debt than savings, that man chose not to be moved. Not by money, not by fire. Not by men in white suits with briefcases full of cash and threats behind their eyes. He stood on his grandfather's land and he stayed on it, and he remembered what it meant, and he fought for it with the only real weapons he had: patience and records and the stubborn refusal to let history be undone. And in doing so, he didn't just save a farm. He reminded a whole country of something it keeps forgetting. That courage doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it looks like a man closing a briefcase. Sometimes it looks like walking into ashes and finding what survived. Sometimes it looks like waking up before the sun again after everything has tried to stop you, and going back into the field because the plants need checking and the work doesn't stop. America learned something the day they heard Elijah Carter's name. One poor farmer, with nothing but 40 acres of dry land and the memory of a man who'd bled to own it, one farmer like that can stand taller than an empire built on fear. Because the land remembers, and so does he.